Revolutionary greetings, comrades. It's a red Sunday, the 8th of December 2024. We continue with our political discussion, looking into the Zimbabwe Communist Party program as adopted at its first Congress in 2019. That was December 2019. There's a developing story. I'm sure comrades are following what is happening in Syria. For the last hour or so, I've been watching Al Jazeera News, getting some updates. I've been reading some other news channels, internet, searching on internet on what is happening. We will possibly in the next few days give an analysis on what is happening and what does it mean to the whole question of the Middle East, the war in Ukraine. So we'll do that at later. We might invite Comrade Ian Bidos to assist us with the analysis on what is happening then. But we continue looking into the program of the Zimbabwe Communist Party. In the last video, we dealt with the introduction, and I hope some of you, the majority of you, were able to follow that discussion. We are looking now into one part, very small part, because we don't want to be long, which deals with the settlers and the big capital. We know that the land we now call Zimbabwe was colonized by British South African Company in 1890. Then two states emerged in 1890 because the British South African Company raised its flag on a hilltop in what is Harare today. And then there was what is normally referred to as the Jameson Line somewhere in Kwekwe. And then in the Ndebele Kingdom fell in 1893, completing the colonization of the entire territory we today call Zimbabwe. So we are saying in this program, let us look more closely at the relationship between the white settlers and the big capital in Britain, Europe, and the United States. The white settlers brought with them European technology and the methods of administration and the built infrastructure. Indeed, there was a development of infrastructure at the time. Through the exploitation of the labor provided by the local black community, which they defeated, they were able to enjoy a living standard higher than most had enjoyed in their country of birth. Abanya Belungu, when they came to South Africa and to Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, they were poor. They were poor. They began to enjoy a lifestyle that they would not have enjoyed in their country of origin. They had access to cheap labor. They had access to big land, which they did not have in their country of origin. They had access to domestic workers, something that they would not have afforded in their countries of origin. It says, the white settlers brought with them European technology and the methods of administration and the built infrastructure. Through the exploitation of the labor provided by the local black community, which they had defeated, they were able to enjoy a living standard higher than most had enjoyed in their country of birth. Many of them hoped to make Rhodesia into a British dominion like Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. But unlike in those countries, they were severely outnumbered by the native inhabitants. The British ruling class were aware that the settlers might not, in the long term, be able to retain power. As early as 1949, one of its most far-sighted members, David Sterling, who lived between 1915 to 1919, established the Capricorn African Society to train young Africans to work in the interests of that class. Once the day of the settler was passed, the slogan of the society was equal rights for all civilized people. In other words, the most educated Africans would be incorporated into the system which they controlled. The real imperialists, those based overseas in Britain and elsewhere, had realized that if they did not step in, the growing power of communist ideas and communist organization, which had grown tremendously during and after the Second World War, would sweep away their control of African resources and undermine their wealth and their privileged positions. Let us try to break down this so that sizwisise ukuthi sichoni in our party program. Firstly, we said in the last video that the mistake that we did during the struggle for national liberation was ukuthi because our colonialists were white, and we thought that the white minority regime or the whites in Rhodesia had the same interests as the white in Britain because they were all white. And we said we thought because we are all black, the political leadership that led the struggle for national liberation and the mass of the people, our interests were similar. It has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt in the last 44 years that our interests with the political leadership, even though they are black, they are not similar to our own interests as the people of Zimbabwe, the majority, because the majority of us are poor. So similarly, the interests of whites in Rhodesia and Britain were not. This is why the Capricorn Society get established in 1949. Capricorn Africa Society get established because Britain understood that at some point there was going to be majority rule. So Britain and their imperialist friends did not want to lose control of the economy. They wanted to control the decisive means of production in Rhodesia. If majority rule was ushered, they were going to continue to control the decisive means of production. In other words, a black government which was going to be established, it was a government that was going to protect their economic interests. This is why David Sterling was assigned to identify young Africans that were trained. Some went to the United States, some went to England to be trained as the future leaders of an independent Zimbabwe. Because if you are trained in Britain, you are trained in the United States, and you are supported by those powers, when you become then the leader of the country, you will be getting your instructions from those capitals that trained you. This, of course, did not stop. Siyayibona even today is taking a new dimension or a new shape, where we have young Africans across the continent that go to the United States for leadership training. Whether it is named Mandela leadership training in the United States, whether Obama leadership training in the United States, it is the same. And the objective is the same. That young Africans who are youth today, who are trained in the United States must be the new generation that takes over the political leadership in Africa and continue to advance the interests of the imperialist forces. We know a number of some of them, bakhona abanye eZimbabwe, some are now members of parliament in Zimbabwe, mainly in the ranks of the opposition, that have been trained under what is called the Obama leadership training or Mandela leadership training in the United States. This is what exactly David Sterling did through the Capricorn African Society. That young people like Takawira were trained, Hepetitepo, Ndabaningi and others were trained in the United States to ensure that the majority rule which was going to come was not going to destabilize, if I were to use Ibala, destabilize our economic interests of the colonialists or of the West. The second point that the Capricorn Africa Society wanted to do, or its second objective, was to curtail the spread of communist ideas in this part of the world. We have discussed previously that in Zimbabwe we are taught false history, in that they would claim that the split of 1963 was based Dr. Joshua Ngoma did not want to fight the secular regime, but to compromise. And this is the history that is being fed to young people. While we all know that at the time of the split, already ZIPRA had been established. Algeria had trained some ZIPRA cadres. We have said, and you know, that it was ZIPRA that lent Itoy from Algeria. They passed it to MK soldiers or cadres, and the MK cadres perfected the Itoy to what we see with Itoy today. So at the time of the split, ZAPU had already made contacts and developed a relationship under the leadership of Joshua Ngoma, developed a relationship with what we call socialist blocs. So to curtail this influence of communist ideas, we had to establish Capricorn Society, which was led by the British Intelligence Office, David Sterling, who then recruited young people in Africa, recruited mainly in Rhodesia. Those were key individuals that were in the forefront of a split of ZAP in 1963. Of course, so explain what the split was said to be over a question of ethnicity. When Dr. Joshua Nkomo, I think, was going to a meeting in Egypt, he was asked which tribe did he belong to, and Dr. Joshua Nkomo dismissed that and was told no, but we were told that the majority tribe in Zimbabwe must be the one that is leading, and now you are from the minority tribe. Dr. Joshua Nkomo dismissed that. But because you needed to use an ethnic card to divide African people. And if you study the history of Africa, be it in Nigeria, be it in Rwanda, all over, in Kenya, all over, ethnicity was used as a tool to divide African people. And this was brought by imperialist forces. So the Capricorn Society played this key role in destabilizing, in dividing the African people. So in our program, as I then move to conclusion, is that yes, there was infrastructural development during the white settler regime, because they wanted Rhodesia to have been like Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. But as we note in our program, is that the white settlers were a tiny minority. We were the majority. That then presented a challenge, because in this part of the world, in South Africa, in Rhodesia then, the white settlers considered the land that they'd moved to as their home. They wanted to establish a home. It was different from the rest of Africa. If you look into West Africa, East Africa, what the colonialists did was to exploit resources, ship them to Europe. But in this part of the world, in Southern Africa, in Rhodesia, in South Africa, they wanted to establish a home, hence the infrastructure that they built. Because they did not want to go back. Babengafuni ukuthi babuyele eBritain. Babefuna ukuthi kube likhaya labo. This is why even Ian Douglas Smith, esekhuluma the last video, ngo-1965, 11 November 1965, unilaterally declared independence. Independence from the crown. And they said they were an independent state. When the war is intensifying, Ian Douglas Smith then wanted to incorporate black people to establish a majority rule, which Yaizoba is sebenzana with the settlers. This is why Abel Mzorewa then gets invited to establish what was called Zimbabwe Rhodesia. So, but from the early days, before the establishment of the Federation, Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, Zambia, and Malawi now, the British understood that majority rule was going to happen. This is why after the collapse of the Federation, then Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, Nyasaland, Malawi got their independence. Then in Southern Rhodesia, they unilaterally declared independence from the crown. So this is what our program speaks about. We will continue in our next discussion when we look into communism and Pan-Africanism in Africa and more in Zimbabwe, because there's a perception which we discussed in the first video, that from 1980 to 1990, Zimbabwe was a socialist state, which is not true. And in our program, we address this question. Thank you so much, comrades, for joining this discussion, and we really appreciate. Otherwise, Amandla, comrades.